They handed out the envelopes at grandfather's funeral like party favors. My cousin Victoria got the Newport mansion, $12 million. My cousin Marcus received the yacht club and investment portfolio, $18 million. Aunt Caroline took the art collection, $9 million. Uncle Richard claimed the business shares, $25 million. Then they got to me. Attorney Mitchell Harrison held up a simple white envelope with my name written in grandfather's shaky handwriting. Inside was a plane ticket to Monaco dated for 3 days from now, a business card for someone called Captain Andre Rousseau, and a handwritten note that said, "Trust the captain, Belle." The rest is waiting. They laughed. Actual laughter in the parlor where grandfather's body had laid in state just hours before. "Poor Belle," Victoria said, adjusting her black Chanel. "I guess you weren't as special as you thought." Even dead, the old man knew who really mattered in this family. I folded the ticket carefully and slipped it into my purse while they divided up what they thought was everything. What none of them knew was that William Harrington had spent 5 years building something they couldn't see, couldn't touch, and definitely couldn't steal. A legacy hidden across an ocean, protected by maritime law and numbered accounts, waiting for the one person he actually trusted. My name is Isabel Harrington, and I'm about to discover that my grandfather's greatest trick wasn't dying, it was making them think they'd won. The Harrington family built their fortune on ships, 3 generations of maritime commerce that transformed a small Rhode Island shipping company into a transatlantic empire. My great-grandfather started with 2 cargo vessels in 1930. By the time my grandfather William took over in 1975, Harrington Maritime controlled 40 ships and operated in 12 countries. I grew up in the shadow of that legacy, literally. Our family estate in Newport overlooked the harbor where Harrington vessels docked, their names painted in the company's signature navy and gold. As a child, I'd watch them come and go, massive container ships that seemed impossible, floating cities carrying goods across oceans. Grandfather would take me to the docks every Saturday, just the 2 of us. He'd introduce me to captains and crew, teach me about shipping routes and cargo manifests, explain how tides and currents worked. My cousins never came on these trips. Victoria was too busy with cotillion and country club tennis. Marcus preferred his video games and later his fraternity parties. They saw the ships as money, nothing more. But grandfather saw them as living things, each with a personality and story. "This is the Margaret Rose," he'd say, hand on a ship's hull like greeting an old friend. She survived a typhoon off the Philippines in '89, saved her entire crew through pure stubbornness. Ships remember Belle. They remember who respects them. My parents died. When I was 9, a car accident on a rainy October night coming back from Boston. After that, grandfather became everything. He moved me into the main house, gave me my mother's old room, made sure I never felt like an orphan, even though technically that's what I was. The rest of the family tolerated this arrangement with varying degrees of resentment. Aunt Caroline, my father's sister, made comments about appropriate boundaries and not spoiling me. Uncle Richard, grandfather's younger son, suggested boarding school might provide better structure. But grandfather ignored them all. "Belle stays with me," he'd said firmly at the family meeting I wasn't supposed to know about. "She's a Harrington, and Harringtons take care of their own." High school was complicated. I attended the same private academy as Victoria and Marcus, which meant enduring their social circle's awareness that I was the poor relation, the orphan cousin living on grandfather's charity. Victoria made sure everyone knew she'd inherit the real money someday. Marcus would joke about me working in the Harrington Maritime mailroom after graduation, filing papers for the family business I'd never actually owned. I escaped into academics and sailing. Grandfather taught me to sail on his vintage yacht, the Catherine, named for my grandmother who died before I was born. By 16, I could handle her alone, navigating Newport Harbor, and sometimes venturing into open ocean when grandfather trusted me with longer trips. Those hours on the water were the only times I felt completely free, away from family politics and social hierarchies. College was my rebellion. I chose Boston University instead of the expected Yale or Princeton, majored in international maritime law instead of business or economics. The family saw it as proof I wasn't serious, that I was wasting my education on a niche field with limited prospects. Grandfather saw it differently. "You're learning the rules, Belle," he told me during one of our phone calls. "That's smart. You can't protect what you don't understand, and you can't change systems you haven't studied." I didn't understand what he meant then. After graduation, I took a position at a maritime law firm in Boston, deliberately avoiding any connection to Harrington Maritime. I wanted to succeed on my own merit, prove I was more than the orphan granddaughter living on family goodwill. I worked 70-hour weeks, became an expert in international shipping regulations and admiralty law, built a reputation that had nothing to do with my last name. Meanwhile, back in Newport, the family dynamics were shifting. Grandfather was 83 and slowing down. He'd handed over day-to-day operations of Harrington Maritime to Uncle Richard 5 years earlier, though he still maintained final authority on major decisions. The vultures were circling, cousins and relatives positioning themselves for the inevitable inheritance. I visited when I could, usually once a month, driving down from Boston for Sunday dinners at the estate. These gatherings were performances, everyone playing their roles. Victoria would talk about her charity work and society connections. Marcus discussed his position at a hedge fund, carefully not mentioning it was at a firm where Uncle Richard was a major investor. Aunt Caroline managed the household and reminded everyone of her sacrifices raising 2 children while supporting grandfather. And me, I was the awkward addition, the granddaughter who'd chosen a different path, who didn't quite fit into their carefully constructed world. The conversations always felt like auditions, everyone showcasing their value to grandfather, making their case for why they deserved the largest inheritance. Only I never auditioned. I'd talk about my cases, about interesting maritime law questions, about trips I'd taken. Grandfather would listen with genuine interest while the others exchanged glances that said she doesn't even realize she's losing. 6 months before he died, Grandfather asked me to take a walk on the beach. It was November, cold and gray, the kind of day that empties Newport of tourists. We walked along the shore near the estate, wind whipping our coats. "Belle," he said without preamble, "I need you to listen carefully and not ask questions until I'm finished." I nodded, suddenly alert. Something in his tone was different. "I've been moving assets for the last 5 years," he continued, quietly, legally, but in ways the family doesn't know about and won't understand. Uncle Richard thinks he's running Harrington Maritime, but he's actually managing about 30% of what we really own. Before I could ask what he meant, he held up a hand. "When I die, there will be a will reading. The family will receive significant inheritances, enough to make them feel victorious. You will receive something that looks insignificant, maybe even insulting." His eyes met mine, sharp despite his age. "Trust me, Belle. Trust the process. Don't react. Don't argue. Don't show any emotion. Take what I give you and follow the instructions exactly." "But grandfather," I started. He stopped walking, turned to face me fully. "There are things I've done, protections I've built, that I can't explain yet. The timing has to be perfect. The legal structures have to be completely in place. If I tell you now, you might accidentally reveal something. You might react differently at the reading. The family is watching you, Belle. They've always watched you, looking for weakness, looking for leverage. I felt cold that had nothing to do with the November wind." "What are you protecting me from?" "From them," he said simply. "From greed, from entitlement, from people who see money as power and loyalty as negotiable. You're the only one who ever loved the ships, Belle. The only one who understood what we really built. The only one I can trust with the truth." The conversation ended there, grandfather claiming fatigue and heading back to the house. I drove back to Boston that night with more questions than answers, but I honored his request. I didn't ask, didn't push, didn't tell anyone about our beach conversation. 3 months later, Grandfather had a stroke. Massive and sudden, the doctor said he probably didn't suffer. The family gathered at Newport Hospital, a death watch that lasted 48 hours before his heart finally stopped. I held his hand at the end, whispered that I loved him, promised I'd trust him no matter what. Victoria cried prettily for the nurses. Marcus looked genuinely shaken, perhaps realizing for the first time that death was real and permanent. Aunt Caroline managed logistics with grim efficiency. Uncle Richard made phone calls about business continuity and board meetings, and I sat with Grandfather's body after they all left, studying the face of the man who'd raised me, who taught me about ships and tides and the difference between price and value. The funeral was enormous, 300 people at Trinity Church, followed by burial in the family plot at Island Cemetery. Ship captains came from around the world, men and women who'd worked for Harrington Maritime for decades. They stood apart from the society crowd, these weathered sailors in their best suits, paying respects to a man they'd actually known rather than just inherited from. Captain James Morrison, who'd commanded the Margaret Rose for 20 years, found me after the service. "Your grandfather was a good man, Miss Bell," he said quietly. "Fair, honest, remembered every crew member's name. There aren't many like him left in this business." "Did he ever mention Monaco to you?" I asked, testing waters. Captain Morrison's expression shifted slightly, became carefully neutral. "Monaco's a beautiful place," he said. "If you ever visit, look up the old maritime quarter. The real captains drink at a bar called Le Scorpion. Tell them James sent you." Then he was gone, disappeared into the crowd before I could ask more. The will reading happened 3 days after the funeral, scheduled for 10 in the morning at the estate's library. Attorney Mitchell Harrison had handled Grandfather's legal affairs for 30 years, a precise man in his 60s who revealed nothing through his expression. The family gathered like sharks, dressed in respectful black, but eyes bright with anticipation. Uncle Richard sat in Grandfather's chair without apparent irony. Aunt Caroline positioned herself near the window, presumably so her tears would be backlit. Victoria and Marcus flanked their mother like bodyguards. I took a seat in the corner, as far from the center of attention as possible, remembering Grandfather's instruction not to react. Mitchell opened his briefcase with ritual precision, extracting documents with ribbons and seals. "Before we begin," he said, "I want to acknowledge that William Harrington was exceptionally thorough in his estate planning. Every provision has been carefully considered and legally structured. There are no accidents in this document." He started with the smaller bequests, staff members receiving generous severances, longtime employees getting bonuses. Then came the family provisions. To my son Richard, control of Harrington Maritime Corporation shares, specifically 30% of outstanding stock, along with the associated voting rights and dividend distributions. Current valuation approximately $25 million. Uncle Richard nodded like this was expected, deserved. To my daughter Caroline, the art collection housed at the Newport estate, professionally appraised at $9.2 million, along with the cottage in Watch Hill valued at $3 million. Aunt Caroline dabbed at her eyes, already calculating auction values. To my granddaughter Victoria, the Newport estate itself, a 32-room mansion on 4 acres, valued at $12 million, along with associated furnishings not specifically bequeathed elsewhere. Victoria actually smiled, breaking the funeral solemnity. To my grandson Marcus, membership and ownership stake in the Newport Yacht Club, the investment portfolio held at Merrill Lynch, and the vacation property in Martha's Vineyard. Combined value approximately $18 million. Marcus leaned back, satisfied. Then Mitchell picked up a simple white envelope. "To my granddaughter, Isabel Catherine Harrington," he read, and the room seemed to lean forward collectively. I watched Mitchell's face, saw nothing. 1 first-class plane ticket to Monaco, departing 3 days from today. 1 business card for Captain André Rousseau, and this personal note from William. He handed me the envelope. Inside, Grandfather's shaky handwriting on cream cardstock. Trust the captain, Belle. The rest is waiting. Follow the lighthouse." The silence in the room lasted maybe 5 seconds before Victoria laughed. "A plane ticket," she said, not even trying to hide her delight. "Oh, Belle, I'm so sorry. That's just, I'm sure grandfather had his reasons, but that seems—" "Harsh," Marcus finished. "Really harsh, actually. Maybe he thought you needed a vacation after all your hard work." More laughter. Mitchell cleared his throat. "There are additional provisions, but they're sealed pending certain conditions. The bulk of the estate has been distributed as specified. Are there any immediate questions?" Uncle Richard raised his hand like he was in a board meeting. "The remaining 30% of Harrington Maritime? Who controls that?" Mitchell's expression remained neutral. "That's among the sealed provisions. It will be revealed when legally appropriate." "But I'm the CEO," Uncle Richard protested. "I need to know the full ownership structure for fiduciary purposes." "You will," Mitchell assured him, "when the conditions are met. Until then, you retain your current authority and your 30%. The meeting dissolved into congratulations and thinly veiled gloating. Victoria was already on her phone with interior designers discussing renovations to her new mansion. Marcus talked about liquidating some investments, maybe buying a bigger boat. Aunt Caroline examined documentation of her art collection, highlighting pieces she'd sell first. And I sat in the corner, holding a plane ticket to Monaco, wondering what the hell grandfather had planned. Mitchell found me as the family dispersed. "Your grandfather left additional instructions for you," he said quietly, handing me a sealed letter. "Don't open it until you're alone. And Miss Harrington, William was the most meticulous man I've ever represented. Nothing he did was random." I drove back to my apartment in Boston that afternoon, the letter burning a hole in my purse. Once inside, doors locked, phone silenced, I finally opened it. "My dearest Belle, grandfather's handwriting was stronger here, as if he'd written this years ago, when his hands were steadier. If you're reading this, then the performance is complete. Your cousins have received what they think is everything, and you've received what they think is nothing. Good. Let them celebrate. Let them believe they've won. The ticket to Monaco is not a consolation prize. It's a key. Captain Andre Rousseau has been my friend and business partner for 40 years. He knows things about Harrington Maritime that no one else knows, manages assets that don't appear in any documents your uncle has seen. When you meet him, tell him the Catherine still sails true. He'll understand. The lighthouse reference is literal. There's a lighthouse outside Monaco Harbor, decommissioned now but still standing. You'll know it when you see it. Andre will take you there. Inside you'll find 3 things: a ledger, a letter, and a key. The ledger shows where the real Harrington Maritime fortune is held. The letter explains why I had to hide it. The key opens something your cousins will never find. Belle, 70% of everything I built is waiting for you. Not 30% like Richard got. Not parcels of property like Caroline and the grandchildren. 70% of the actual empire, the ships they don't know about, the routes they've never seen, the accounts held in jurisdictions they can't access. I've spent 5 years moving it, hiding it, protecting it from the greed I saw growing in my own family. You're the only one who ever loved the ships for what they are rather than what they're worth. You're the only one who studied maritime law, who understands how international shipping actually works, who could protect this legacy properly. The inheritance they received is generous, more than most people see in a lifetime, but it's not the kingdom. You're getting the kingdom, Belle. Use it well. Protect it. Build on it. And when you're ready, when you understand the full scope of what I've left you, there are instructions for revealing the truth to the family. There's a time limit built in, legal structures that will trigger automatically if you don't claim your inheritance within 6 months. But I know you, granddaughter. You'll be on that plane to Monaco. You'll find Andre, and you'll discover that sometimes the best revenge isn't dramatic confrontation. It's quiet competence and the slow realization of fools that they celebrated too early. I love you, Belle. I always have. The ships are yours now. Sail them well. I read the letter 3 times, hands shaking, brain struggling to process what grandfather was saying. 70%, not a plane ticket as an insult, a plane ticket as the first step in claiming an empire. I pulled out my laptop and started researching. Captain André Rousseau appeared in maritime records going back decades, a French national who'd commanded various vessels, held licenses in multiple countries, and according to his LinkedIn profile, currently worked as a maritime consultant based in Monaco. The business card had a phone number with a Monaco country code. I looked at the plane ticket, first class, direct flight from Boston to Nice, departing in 3 days. Return ticket open-ended. I thought about my cousins, probably right now touring their new properties, calculating their net worths, planning how to spend their millions. Thought about Uncle Richard, sitting in grandfather's chair at Harrington Maritime, believing he controlled the company. Thought about grandfather on that cold November beach, telling me to trust him. I picked up my phone and dialed the Monaco number. It rang 4 times before a voice answered in French-accented English. Rousseau, Captain André Rousseau, my name is Isabel Harrington, William's granddaughter. There was a pause, then a warm laugh. Belle, I've been waiting for your call. Your grandfather said you would be the one to understand, the one to see past the performance. The Catherine still sails true, I said, repeating grandfather's code. She does indeed, André confirmed, and you have a plane to catch. When you arrive, I'll meet you at the airport. We have much to discuss and a lighthouse to visit. How much did grandfather hide? I asked. Enough, André said, that your family's celebration is very premature. See you in 3 days, Belle. Welcome to your real inheritance. He hung up, leaving me sitting in my apartment with a plane ticket, a cryptic letter, and the growing realization that grandfather hadn't just left me a legacy. He'd left me a secret empire, hidden in plain sight across an ocean, protected by maritime law and numbered accounts. And somewhere in Monaco, in a decommissioned lighthouse, waited the proof that would change everything. 3 days. I had 3 days to prepare, to research, to understand what I was walking into. I opened my laptop and started searching for everything I could find about Monaco maritime law, international shipping regulations, and offshore asset protection. The family thought they'd won. Grandfather had taught them to think exactly that. But the game wasn't over, it was just beginning. The flight to Nice took 8 hours, time I spent reviewing everything I knew about international maritime law and asset protection. By the time we landed, I'd filled a legal pad with notes and questions, patterns I was beginning to see in grandfather's strategy. Captain André Rousseau was waiting at arrivals, exactly as he'd promised. He was in his mid-60s, weathered face, and steady eyes that marked him as someone who'd spent decades at sea. He wore casual linen, completely at ease in the Mediterranean heat that hit me like a wall after Boston's spring chill. Miss Harrington, he said, extending his hand. You have your grandfather's eyes, determined. He led me to a vintage Mercedes parked in a loading zone, apparently unconcerned about parking regulations. As we drove along the coast toward Monaco, he spoke without preamble. William began planning this 5 years ago, after your Uncle Richard made a presentation to the board about maximizing shareholder value. Richard wanted to sell 3 of our oldest ships, the ones that were less profitable but employed loyal crews. William realized then that his son saw the business as numbers on a spreadsheet rather than people and legacy. What did he do? I asked. He started moving assets, André said, quietly, legally, but in ways that wouldn't appear in the corporate books Richard had access to. Ships were transferred to subsidiary companies. Routes were restructured through different corporate entities. Accounts were opened in jurisdictions that respect maritime privacy. Over 5 years, he essentially created a shadow empire. And you helped him, I said. I've known William since 1978, André replied. We were young captains together before he inherited the family business. When he came to me with this plan, I understood immediately. He wasn't hiding assets for tax evasion or illegal purposes. He was protecting a legacy from people who would destroy it for short-term profit. We drove into Monaco, that impossible city-state where mountains meet Mediterranean, where every building seems to cascade down toward a harbor filled with yachts worth more than small countries. Andre navigated narrow streets with the ease of a local, finally parking near the old maritime quarter Captain Morrison had mentioned. This area, Andre gestured to the waterfront, is where real sailors gather, not the yacht club crowd, not the racing teams, the people who actually work on ships, who understand what your grandfather built. He led me to a bar called Le Scorpion, dim and smelling of salt and whiskey. Inside, a dozen men and women sat at worn tables, conversations in multiple languages. They looked up when we entered, and I saw recognition in their eyes. They knew who I was, or at least who I was supposed to be. "This is Belle Harrington," Andre announced to the room, "William's granddaughter." A moment of silence, then a gray-haired woman stood and raised her glass. "To William," she said in German-accented English, a captain who never forgot, his crew. To William, the room echoed, and I felt tears, threatening. These were grandfather's real family, the people who'd worked his ships and respected his leadership. They drank to him while my blood relatives divided his estate. Andre ordered us coffee and sat across from me at a corner table. "The lighthouse is 10 minutes from here," he said. "Inside, you'll find documents that explain everything. But first, I need to brief you on what you're inheriting so you understand the scope." He pulled out a tablet, opening a file with ship registries and corporate structures. "Harrington Maritime Corporation, the company your uncle thinks he runs, controls 42 vessels. But there's another entity, Harrington International Shipping, registered in Liberia with operational headquarters here in Monaco. It controls 68 vessels." 68, I repeated, stunned. "Your grandfather spent 5 years acquiring ships through this separate entity, using profits from HMC operations that he diverted through legitimate but complex corporate structures. He bought older vessels that other companies were retiring, refurbished them, hired crews from the captains he trusted, built a completely parallel shipping operation." "That's impossible," I said. "Uncle Richard would have noticed ships missing, revenue disappearing." Andre smiled. "Would he? Your uncle focuses on the premium routes, the high-value cargo between major ports. William focused on secondary routes, smaller ports, specialized cargo. He essentially made the boring parts of the business so reliably profitable that Richard never looked closely at them. Meanwhile, those boring parts were funding an entirely separate fleet. He swiped through screens showing shipping routes, cargo manifests, financial statements. Harrington International Shipping generated approximately $400 million in revenue last year. After operational costs, that's roughly $120 million in profit, all held in accounts your uncle has never seen. The terminal value of the fleet, given current market conditions, is approximately $2 billion. I couldn't breathe. $2 billion. Your cousins received millions, Andre continued. You're inheriting billions. But it comes with responsibility, Belle. These 68 ships employ over 3,000 people. They have families, mortgages, children in school. Your grandfather didn't build this just to hide money. He built it to protect jobs and preserve a way of doing business that values people over pure profit. "Why me?" I asked. "Why not Uncle Richard, or at least give him a chance to prove himself?" Andre's expression softened. William watched Richard for 30 years, watched him lay off loyal employees to improve quarterly numbers, watched him cancel pension programs to increase shareholder dividends, watched him treat ships as disposable assets and crews as interchangeable labor. Then William watched you, Belle. Watched you study maritime law so you could protect sailors' rights. Watched you take cases defending crews against corporate negligence. Watched you sail the Catherine with the same respect he'd taught you as a child. He knew you'd see these ships as he did, as communities on water rather than just profit centers. We finished our coffee in silence. Then Andre drove me along the coast to a small peninsula where an old lighthouse stood, white stone weathered by decades of salt and wind. It had been decommissioned years ago, replaced by modern navigation systems, but someone had maintained it carefully. Andre produced a key and unlocked the lighthouse door. Inside, a spiral staircase led up to what had been the light room. Now it was an office, complete with filing cabinets, a desk, and floor-to-ceiling windows showing the Mediterranean. On the desk sat 3 items, exactly as grandfather's letter had promised: a ledger, thick and bound in leather, a letter in a sealed envelope, and a key, old brass with an elaborate head. Andre gestured to the desk. "I'll wait downstairs. Take your time. This is between you and William." He descended the stairs, leaving me alone with my inheritance. I opened the ledger first. Inside, page after page of grandfather's handwriting, documenting 5 years of planning, ship acquisitions with dates and prices, corporate structure diagrams showing how entities connected, account numbers for banks in Liberia, Panama, Monaco, Singapore, routes and contracts and crew manifests. It was a complete parallel empire, meticulously documented. Interspersed with the business records were personal notes. January 2019, Richard fired Captain Thompson after 30 years of service, 3 years short of full pension. Claimed performance issues. Real reason was Thompson questioned safety shortcuts. I hired Thompson for his, gave him the Nordic Star. He's 60 now, planning to retire with full benefits in 3 years. April 2020, Bell won her first major case, defending Filipino crew members against wage theft by their employer. She worked pro bono, spent 6 months on it. This is who she is. This is why she gets everything. The notes continued, a chronicle of Uncle Richard's failures and my unconscious audition for a role I hadn't known I was playing. By the time I finished reading, I understood completely. Grandfather hadn't been choosing favorites. He'd been choosing a successor who shared his values. The letter was next, several pages in grandfather's handwriting, stronger here, like he'd written it early in his planning. My dearest Belle, by now you've seen the ledger and understand what I've built. Harrington International Shipping is yours, completely and legally. The ownership documents are in the filing cabinet, along with bank account access codes and contact information for the board I've assembled to help you manage it. But ownership comes with choices, and I want you to understand what I hope you'll do with this inheritance, though ultimately the decisions are yours. First, the revelation. Your uncle and cousins received generous inheritances from what they believed was my entire estate. They're wrong, but they don't know that yet. You have 6 months from my death to decide whether and how to reveal Harrington International Shipping's existence. There are several options. Option 1, you reveal everything immediately. Show them the ledger, the ships, the accounts. Watch them realize they celebrated prematurely. This would be emotionally satisfying but strategically messy. They'd contest, claiming undue influence or hidden assets that should have been part of the primary estate. You'd win eventually, the legal structures are airtight, but it would take years and cost millions in legal fees. Option 2, you reveal nothing. Run his quietly, build it further, and let them think forever that they got the real inheritance. This is cleanest legally, but it means maintaining the fiction that you're the poor cousin while secretly controlling a larger empire than theirs. You'd need to be comfortable with that long-term deception. Option 3, and this is what I recommend, you wait 3 months, then reveal his, in a controlled way that serves a strategic purpose. I've built in a mechanism for this. The sealed provisions in my will that Mitchell mentioned. 3 months after my death, if you choose to activate them, Mitchell will call a second family meeting and reveal the full estate structure. By then, your cousins will have spent months enjoying their inheritances, maybe making financial decisions based on their new wealth. The revelation will be more impactful, and you'll have had time to establish yourself with his operations. The choice is yours, Belle. I trust your judgment completely. Second, the business. His currently employs 3,000 people and operates profitably. But I've been conservative in my growth because I was managing this secretly while running HMC publicly. You don't have that constraint. You can expand, acquire more ships, pursue routes I couldn't risk. I've left detailed recommendations in the filing cabinet. But again, these are suggestions. You're the captain now. Third, your uncle. Richard is not a bad man, Belle. He's a product of business school thinking that prioritizes shareholders over stakeholders, quarterly profits over long-term stability. He genuinely believes his approach is correct, modern, efficient. He'll be hurt when he learns about his, not just because of the money, but because it proves I didn't trust him with my real legacy. You'll need to decide how to handle that relationship, whether to try to educate him or simply to move forward separately. Finally, the key. It opens a safe deposit box at Banque Cantonale de Monaco, account number on the tag. Inside that box is my personal journal from the last 5 years, documenting not just the business moves, but my thoughts and feelings as I built this plan. Read it when you're ready. It explains things this letter can't, including mistakes I made with Richard when he was young, ways I perhaps failed him that contributed to who he became. You might learn something useful about leadership and family. I love you, granddaughter. The ships are yours. The choice of what to do with them is yours. The timeline for revelation is yours. I've given you tools and options, but I trust you to make the right decisions because you've demonstrated wisdom I failed to instill in my own children. Fair winds and following seas. I set the letter down, hands shaking. 3 options, 6 months to decide, and a secret empire waiting for my direction. The key felt heavy in my palm, old brass warm from the Mediterranean sun streaming through lighthouse windows. I descended the stairs to find André waiting, patience that came from years at sea. "Well?" he asked. "I understand," I said. "All of it. The why, the how, the what comes next." André nodded. "Your grandfather said you would. What do you need from me?" "I need to see the ships," I said. "Not reports or manifests. I need to physically visit them, meet the captains, understand what I'm really inheriting. Then I need 3 months to establish myself before revealing anything to my family." André smiled. "William said you'd choose option 3, said you had his sense of timing. I've already prepared an itinerary, 14 ships in 7 ports over the next month. We start in Genoa tomorrow. That night I stayed in a small hotel in Monaco's old quarter, mind-racing with plans and possibilities. I called Mitchell Harrison on his personal number. "The sealed provisions grandfather mentioned," I said. "How do I activate them?" "There's a document you need to sign," Mitchell replied, clearly unsurprised by my call. "Once signed, I'm instructed to schedule a second family meeting exactly 3 months from the date of signature. At that meeting, I'll reveal the complete estate structure including Harrington International Shipping. I'll sign it tomorrow before I leave Monaco," I said. "But Mitchell, I need to understand the legal protections. Is there any way they can contest this?" Mitchell's voice carried certainty earned from 30 years of practice. "Belle, your grandfather and I built legal structures that have been reviewed by 3 separate international law firms. His is completely separate from HMC, legally distinct entities. The assets were moved properly, documented thoroughly, with legitimate business purposes. Your cousins received exactly what William's will specified they should receive from his primary estate. They have no claim to his assets because those were never part of HMC to begin with." "Even if they contest?" I asked. "Even if they contest," Mitchell confirmed. "They'd lose, probably be sanctioned for frivolous litigation, and waste their inheritances on legal fees. Your grandfather was meticulous, Belle. Trust that." The next month was a revelation. André and I traveled to ports across the Mediterranean and into the Atlantic, visiting Harrington, international ships. I met Captain Sarah Chen on the Nordic Star, the ship that employed Captain Thompson after Uncle Richard had fired him. I stood on the bridge of the Baltic Pearl with Captain James Okonkwo, who'd worked for grandfather for 20 years. I toured the Pacific Dawn with Captain Maria Santos, who'd been the first woman captain in Harrington maritime history until Uncle Richard had reassigned her to a desk job. Grandfather had rescued her, given her the Pacific Dawn, let her return to sea. Every ship had a story. Every captain had a reason to be loyal to William Harrington's vision rather than Richard Harrington's spreadsheets. They weren't just employees. They were believers in a way of doing business that valued skill and loyalty over pure efficiency. In Genoa, I met with the HIS board, 5 maritime industry veterans who'd been advising grandfather for years. They reviewed operations, discussed expansion opportunities, presented options for my consideration. They treated me as the CEO I'd suddenly become, deferring to my decisions while offering expertise I desperately needed. "You have your grandfather's instincts," Board Chair Elena Marchetti told me after one long meeting. He'd describe a problem, you'd propose a solution, and it would be almost exactly what he would have suggested. "You were trained for this, Belle, even if you didn't know you were being trained." By the end of the month, I understood what I'd inherited. Not just ships and accounts, but a philosophy of business that balanced profit with purpose, efficiency with humanity. Grandfather had built something rare in modern commerce, a company that succeeded financially while refusing to sacrifice the people who made that success possible. I returned to Boston with new clarity and a signed document activating the sealed provisions. 3 months from now, Mitchell would call the family meeting and reveal everything. Until then, I had work to do, establishing myself as his CEO while maintaining the fiction that I was still the poor cousin with nothing but a plane ticket. The deception was easier than expected. My family was so absorbed in their new wealth that they barely noticed my absence. Victoria was renovating the Newport mansion, Instagram documenting every design choice. Marcus had bought a yacht and was posting photos from Caribbean trips. Aunt Caroline was auctioning some of her art pieces, treating it like a social project. Uncle Richard was making changes at HMC exactly as grandfather had predicted. He'd announced a restructuring plan that would cut 200 jobs to improve operational efficiency. He'd begun negotiations to sell the Margaret Rose, the ship that had survived the typhoon, claiming older vessels didn't fit the modern fleet profile. He was doing exactly what grandfather had feared, prioritizing profit margins over people and legacy. I wanted to stop him, to reveal everything immediately. But I remembered grandfather's advice about timing. Let them show who they really are first. Let them make decisions that reveal their values. Then the revelation will mean something. The 3 months felt endless. I commuted between Boston and Monaco, managing my maritime law cases while secretly running a billion-dollar shipping operation. I attended family dinners when required, playing the role of humble cousin, while knowing I controlled more ships than Uncle Richard had ever seen. At one particularly difficult Sunday dinner, Victoria mentioned how generous it was of grandfather to have given me that Monaco trip. "I mean, it's not money," she said, adjusting the new Cartier bracelet she'd bought with her inheritance. "But it was sweet of him to think of you. Travel is enriching." "Very enriching," I agreed, thinking of the $2 billion fleet I'd spent the month inspecting. Uncle Richard was in a good mood that night, explaining his vision for HMC's future. "We're going to be leaner, more competitive," he said. "Some of the old guard doesn't like the changes, but that's nostalgia talking. Modern shipping is about efficiency and shareholder return." "What about the crews?" I asked carefully. "The people who've worked for Harrington Maritime for decades. They'll adapt or find other opportunities," Richard said. "That's business, Belle. You can't let sentiment interfere with smart management." I smiled and said nothing, counting down the days until Mitchell's call. The second family meeting was scheduled for exactly 3 months after I'd signed the activation document. Mitchell sent formal notices requesting everyone's presence at the Newport Estate Library at 10 a.m. on a Saturday. Victoria complained about the timing. She had a charity luncheon. Marcus tried to postpone. He had regatta plans. But Mitchell was firm. "This is a required meeting per the terms of William's estate. All beneficiaries must attend." They gathered with obvious impatience, clearly expecting some minor administrative detail. I arrived early, positioning myself in the same corner I'd occupied during the first reading, watching them settle into their assumed roles. Uncle Richard in grandfather's chair, Aunt Caroline near the window, Victoria and Marcus flanking their mother. Mitchell began with customary formality. Thank you all for coming. As I mentioned during the initial will reading, there were sealed provisions that would be revealed when legally appropriate. That time has arrived. He opened a folder containing documents I'd already reviewed. William's will specified that if his granddaughter Isabel activated certain contingencies within 6 months of his death, I was to provide the following information to the family. Isabel activated those contingencies 3 months ago. I felt their eyes turn toward me, confusion beginning. Mitchell continued, his voice steady and professional. The estate distributed 3 months ago represented William's personal assets and his holdings in Harrington Maritime Corporation. However, William also controlled a separate legal entity called Harrington International Shipping, registered in Liberia with operational headquarters in Monaco. He pulled up a presentation on his laptop, projecting it onto the library wall. Ship manifests appeared, 68 vessels with their routes and specifications. His currently operates 68 vessels on routes throughout the Mediterranean, Atlantic, and Pacific. The fleet employs approximately 3,000 people and generated $400 million in revenue last year. Total fleet value is approximately $2 billion. The silence was absolute. Uncle Richard had gone pale. Victoria's mouth hung open. Marcus looked like he was doing math in his head and not liking the results. William transferred ownership of Harrington International Shipping to Isabel 5 years ago, Mitchell continued. The transfers were legal, properly documented, and executed with sound business purposes. Isabel has been CEO of his for the past 3 months, though she chose not to announce it until this meeting. That's impossible, Uncle Richard said, his voice strained. I would have known. There's no way to hide 68 ships. You knew the ships, Mitchell corrected. You just didn't know they were Harrington vessels. William bought them through subsidiary companies, operated them under different corporate structures, managed them through networks you weren't part of. He essentially created a shadow empire over 5 years, moving profits from HMC operations to fund his expansion. You stole from the company, Uncle Richard accused, looking at me with betrayal. You and grandfather conspired to steal assets. Actually, Mitchell interrupted smoothly, every transfer was legal and properly disclosed to the HMC board in documents you signed without reading carefully. William diverted profits, not assets. He used HMC earnings to fund new ship acquisitions through separate corporate entities. Aggressive accounting, perhaps, but entirely legal. Victoria found her voice. So Belle got billions while we got millions. That's not fair. That's not what grandfather intended. Mitchell produced another document. Would you like me to read William's letter explaining exactly what he intended? He addressed this situation specifically. Please do, I said quietly. Mitchell read grandfather's words aloud, the letter explaining his reasoning. How he'd watched Uncle Richard prioritize profit over people. How he'd seen me defend crew rights and study maritime law. How he'd chosen to protect the legacy by giving it to someone who shared his values. By the end, Aunt Caroline was crying. Uncle Richard sat frozen, processing betrayal and realization. Victoria looked furious. Marcus just looked defeated. There's more, Mitchell said. William anticipated that Richard might contest this arrangement or attempt to challenge Isabel's ownership of his. He therefore included a poison pill provision. If any beneficiary of his will initiates legal action regarding his assets, their inheritance from the primary estate is forfeit and redistributed to maritime charities. You can't do that, Victoria protested. It's legal coercion. It's a standard no-contest clause, Mitchell replied, perfectly legal and increasingly common in estate planning. You can accept what you received, or you can challenge and lose everything. Your choice. Uncle Richard finally spoke, his voice hollow. He didn't trust me. 30 years running this company, and he didn't trust me with his real legacy. He trusted you with 30% of HMC, I said gently. $25 million and control of a profitable corporation. That's not nothing, Uncle Richard. He just didn't trust you with the part that required valuing people over profits. You fired Captain Thompson 3 years before his pension vested, I continued. Grandfather hired him for his and made sure he'd retire with full benefits. You wanted to sell the Margaret Rose. Grandfather kept her in the HIS fleet because she has history and a loyal crew. You see ships as assets. He saw them as communities. Uncle Richard's face was red. So what? You're going to run a shipping empire at 32? You've been a lawyer for 6 years. I've been CEO of his for 3 months, I replied. I've visited every ship, met every captain, reviewed every route. I've also assembled a board of industry veterans who provide guidance. And yes, I'm 32. But Grandfather was 30 when he took over, and you were 35. Age isn't the issue. The issue is philosophy. We sat in heavy silence. Finally, Aunt Caroline spoke. What happens now? Now, I said, standing and walking to the center of the room where I could face them all, you have choices. You can accept what Grandfather gave you, which was generous by any standard. You can be angry about what I received, though that anger won't change anything. Or you can try to contest, lose your inheritances, and waste years in litigation you'll ultimately lose. I looked at each of them. I'm not interested in gloating or punishing you. Grandfather built something remarkable, and he chose to protect it by giving it to someone who would preserve his values. I intend to honor that trust. His will continue operating as it has, providing good jobs and reliable service. HMC will continue under Uncle Richard's management, and I have no plans to interfere. We can be a family that coexists with different inheritances, or we can be a family destroyed by resentment. Your choice. Mitchell began packing his documents. If anyone wishes to contest, you have 30 days to file. After that, the estate is settled permanently. Victoria stood abruptly. This is bullshit. Come on, Marcus. She swept from the room, her brother following. Aunt Caroline looked at me with something like sadness. He really loved you best, didn't he? He loved us differently, I corrected. He gave you what he thought you'd value, art and property and money. He gave me what he thought I'd protect. That's not better or worse, just different. She left without responding. Uncle Richard remained, staring at the projected image of 68 ships he'd never known existed. Did he say anything, he asked quietly? About me? About why? Mitchell pulled out another letter. He left this for you, Richard. Personal, not part of the formal will. To be delivered if you asked. Uncle Richard took it with shaking hands, read it silently. I watched his face change, saw grief and regret, and something like understanding pass across his features. When he finished, he looked at me. He says he failed me, that he taught me to see the business as numbers, because that's what he thought success looked like. Says he realized too late that he'd created exactly the kind of manager he didn't want running his legacy. I'm sorry, I said honestly. I'm sorry he felt he couldn't trust you, and I'm sorry this revelation hurt. Uncle Richard stood, folded the letter carefully. I need time to process this. If you don't contest, I said, there's no reason we can't maintain a working relationship. HMC and his could even partner on routes, share resources, function as allied companies. He nodded stiffly and left. Mitchell closed his briefcase. That went better than William predicted. He thought Richard might flip the table. Give him time, I said. This is a lot to absorb. Mitchell smiled. You handled that well, Belle. Your grandfather would be proud. Not just of what you said, but of the 3 months you spent establishing yourself before revealing anything. Timing matters in estate work as much as in shipping. After he left, I stood alone in the library where this had all begun 3 months ago. The room where I'd received a plane ticket and watched my cousins celebrate. The room where they'd laughed at my inheritance. I pulled out my phone and called Andre in Monaco. It's done, I said. The revelation happened. The family knows. And their reaction, he asked. Shock, anger, hurt. exactly what grandfather predicted. They'll need time. They'll have it, Andre said. Meanwhile, we have ships to run and an empire to build. Sarah Chen wants to discuss the Southeast Asian expansion. James Okonkwo has ideas about African routes we're not currently serving. Your grandfather built the foundation, Belle. Now you get to build the future. I walked out of the estate and down to the harbor, where the Catherine was moored. Grandfather's vintage yacht, the one he'd taught me to sail on, the one that had carried me through adolescence and into independence. I stepped aboard, feeling the familiar deck beneath my feet, started the engine, cast off lines, pointed her bow toward open water. As I sailed out of Newport Harbor, I thought about grandfather on that November beach, telling me to trust him. Thought about the plane ticket that had seemed like an insult, but was actually a key. Thought about 3 months of secret empire building while my family celebrated their smaller victories. They'd gotten millions. I'd gotten billions and responsibility and a legacy that came with obligations to 3,000 employees who depended on decisions I'd make. They'd gotten property and art and investments. I'd gotten ships and routes and a philosophy of business that valued people. They'd gotten what they wanted. I'd gotten what grandfather knew I needed. Fair winds and following seas, I whispered to the wind, to the water, to the memory of the man who'd protected me one last time. The Catherine's sails filled, and I sailed toward a future grandfather had spent 5 years building, toward an empire hidden in plain sight, toward a legacy earned not through blood, but through values. Behind me, Newport receded. My family would make their choices, contest or accept, resent or reconcile. Ahead, 68 ships waited across oceans, communities of sailors who'd chosen to work for a company that still believed profit and purpose could coexist. I was 32 years old, CEO of a billion-dollar shipping operation, keeper of a legacy my cousins had never understood. Not because I was special or favored, but because I'd learned to love ships the way grandfather did, as living things with stories and souls rather than assets with valuations. The rest, as grandfather had written, had been waiting, and now it was mine.